The darkest event in every century, 1st to 21st century. History can be inspiring, but today we're not talking about the inspiring parts. We're looking at the moments where humanity fell apart. The plagues, wars, collapses, and catastrophes that left deep scars on entire civilizations. Every century has at least one event so dark that it shaped the world around it. And when you line them all up, century after century, the pattern becomes clear. Humanity has survived a lot, often barely. So today, we're going on a journey from the 1st century all the way to the 21st, exploring the darkest event in each era. This is your warning. It gets grim. Grab a snack, grab a blanket, grab emotional support if needed, and let's begin. 1st century. Siege of Jerusalem, 70 CE. The 1st century ends with one of the most brutal sieges in ancient history. After a Jewish revolt, Rome responded with overwhelming force, surrounding Jerusalem and cutting off all supplies. Starvation set in. Diseases spread. People fought over scraps of food. Some ancient accounts, like those of Josephus, describe desperation so severe it defies imagination. When the Romans finally breached the walls, the fighting turned into a massacre. The Second Temple, a sacred symbol of Jewish identity, was burned to the ground. Tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. This single event reshaped Middle Eastern history for centuries. And unfortunately, the next century wouldn't be any kinder, because something invisible and deadly was on the move. 2nd century. The Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE. The Roman world was thriving. Trade, wealth, armies, philosophy, but all of that shattered when soldiers returning from campaign carried home a mysterious disease. The Antonine Plague tore through cities and military camps alike. Symptoms described by ancient doctors sound eerily like smallpox. Up to 5 million people died, including Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king himself. Entire legions were crippled. Cities lost so many people that fields went untilled, workshops closed, and taxes dried up. Some historians argue this was the beginning of Rome's long decline. An empire can build roads and aqueducts, but even Rome couldn't fight a virus. 3rd century. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE. If you ever think your government is unstable, just look at Rome in the 3rd century. In just 50 years, the empire cycled through almost 50 emperors, most murdered by their own troops. Civil wars erupted constantly. Rival emperors declared themselves rulers of breakaway states. Barbarian invasions increased. Economies crashed. Famine and plague spread. The empire nearly split apart permanently. It was one of the closest calls in Roman history, a near-total collapse of one of the world's greatest superpowers. Rome survived, barely, but the next century would bring the battle that changed its fate forever. 4th century. Battle of Adrianople, 378 CE. In 378 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire faced the Goths in a battle they expected to win. Instead, it turned into one of Rome's greatest defeats. The Gothic army annihilated the Romans. Emperor Valens was killed. The Eastern Field Army, the core of Rome's military power, was destroyed. This battle exposed how weak the empire had become. It was the moment many historians point to when Rome's fall became inevitable. Within a century, the Western Empire would be gone. 5th century. Fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 CE. By the late 5th century, Rome wasn't a superpower. It was a corpse waiting for burial. Barbarian warlords controlled the land. Economies had shrunk. Cities depopulated. Trade routes collapsed. In 476 CE, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer. No dramatic battle, no heroic stand. Just a quiet end to a 1,000-year empire. What followed was centuries of political fragmentation and suffering across Europe. And as Europe drifted into the early Middle Ages, an even greater catastrophe was on its way, one that killed faster than any empire ever could. 6th century, Plague of Justinian, 541 to 549 CE. This was the first great pandemic in recorded European history, caused by the same bacteria that would later cause the Black Death. It killed 25 to 50 million people, nearly half of Europe. In Constantinople, bodies filled the streets. Mass graves overflowed. Workers died so quickly that crops rotted in the fields. The Byzantine Empire nearly fell apart as tax revenue collapsed and armies shrank. It was, quite literally, a preview of medieval apocalypse. 7th century, collapse of the Sasanian Empire, 602 to 651. Persia's mighty Sasanian Empire should have been one of history's great powers, but war, plague, economic exhaustion, and internal chaos tore it apart. After a long and brutal war with Byzantium, the empire was left crippled. Then came internal rebellion, then plague, and finally the Islamic Caliphate swept through, defeating the Persians in a rapid series of battles. An empire that had existed for centuries collapsed in just a few decades. 8th century, An-Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763. The Tang dynasty was one of China's golden ages, wealthy, powerful, and culturally advanced. Then General An-Lushan rebelled. What followed was 8 years of slaughter, famine, economic collapse, and political chaos. The death toll is still debated, but estimates go as high as 36 million people, or about 15% of the global population. China never fully recovered. The rebellion forever weakened the Tang dynasty, and while China struggled to rebuild, Europe was about to face a different kind of terror, fast, brutal, and arriving from the sea. 9th century, Viking raids peak, 800s. In the 9th century, Viking raids struck fear across Europe. Longships appeared without warning. Monasteries were attacked. Towns were burned. People were enslaved. To medieval monks, Vikings weren't just raiders, they were apocalyptic forces, striking faster than kingdoms could defend against. Their raids reshaped Europe's political structure and forced kingdoms to fortify or die. 10th century, famine and collapse in Egypt, 900s. The 10th century saw political instability across the Middle East, but Egypt faced one of the worst famines in its history. The Nile failed to flood properly for years. Crops withered. Markets collapsed. Chroniclers described starvation so severe that entire families died in their homes. Society broke down. Some sources even claim cannibalism emerged in the worst-hit regions. It was one of the clearest examples of how climate and political dysfunction can destroy a civilization. 11th century, the famine before the Battle of Hastings, 1066. Before the famous Norman conquest, England faced severe crop failures. People were starving. Food prices skyrocketed. Villagers fled their homes seeking help. Then 2 armies marched over the countryside, consuming what little food remained. Thousands died before the battle even began. It's easy to remember kings and soldiers, but famine was the real killer of 1066. 12th century, the Great Famine, 1170 to 1172. Europe was once again gripped by famine. For 2 years, rains failed, crops died, and livestock disappeared. Chroniclers wrote of people eating grass, bark, and anything they could find. In isolated towns, stories emerged of cannibalism. Markets collapsed. Governments failed to respond. It was a stark reminder of how fragile medieval society was. But even this famine would look small compared to what the next century unleashed. 13th century, the Mongol invasions. Genghis Khan and his armies swept across Asia with unprecedented speed and brutality. Cities were razed, populations were wiped out. In some regions, forests literally grew over the ruins of former civilizations. Estimates suggest 40 million deaths, about 10% of the world's population. The Mongol expansion forever reshaped the political and cultural map of Eurasia. 14th century, the Black Death, 1347–1351, the deadliest plague in human history. Between 75 to 200 million people died worldwide. Europe lost 1/3 of its population. Society collapsed. Labor shortages reshaped economies. Religion, politics, and social order all changed forever. The medieval world essentially ended, and a new era began. 15th century, fall of Constantinople, 1453. The last remnant of the Roman Empire fell after an intense siege by the Ottomans. Mass death, enslavement, and destruction followed. It marked the end of Byzantium and shifted power in the Eastern Mediterranean permanently. For many, it was the symbolic end of the Middle Ages. 16th century, conquest of the Aztecs, 1521. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs combined warfare, political manipulation, and, most devastating, European disease. Smallpox wiped out entire cities. The Aztec population declined by up to 90% within decades. Temples were destroyed. Culture was suppressed. It was one of the greatest cultural losses in world history. 17th century, 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. Europe was torn apart for 3 decades. What started as a religious war spiraled into continent-wide destruction. Armies looted everything. Civilians starved. Disease swept through towns. Up to 8 million people died. Some regions of Germany lost over half their population. 18th century, Atlantic slave trade peak, 1700s. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, packed into ships under horrific conditions, and sold into slavery. The Middle Passage alone killed countless people. The suffering caused generational trauma that still affects the world today. It's one of the darkest systems ever created by human hands. 19th century, Irish potato famine, 1845 to 1852. A potato blight destroyed Ireland's main food source. British policies worsened the crisis. 1 million died. 2 million emigrated. Entire communities vanished. The cultural impact is still felt today, especially among Irish diaspora communities. 20th century, World War II, 1939 to 1945. The deadliest conflict ever recorded. 70 to 85 million people died. Genocide, firebombing, nuclear weapons, total war, famine, cities erased. Humanity saw the absolute worst it was capable of. 21st century, Syrian Civil War, 2011 to present. Hundreds of thousands killed, millions displaced, cities destroyed. A refugee crisis that reshaped geopolitics. It's a reminder that the darkest chapters of history aren't ancient. Many are still unfolding. From plagues to invasions, from collapses to wars, every century shows us just how fragile civilization is, and how much we must learn from the past. If you enjoyed this journey through history's darkest moments, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Which century do you think had the darkest event? Your pick might make it into part 2.